It was June of 1982 in Braxton County. The air was already thick with the promise of a long, hot summer, the kind that baked the clay soil into a cracked and pale imitation of earth. Dust, fine as sifted flour, coated the leaves of the pokeweed along the county roads and settled in a thin film on every windowsill. It was a time of waiting, waiting for rain, waiting for the corn to tassel, waiting for something to change. For Elspeth May, the waiting was over. She stood at the edge of the old hemlock place, her boots planted firmly in the dry, stubborn grass that grew along the fence row. Elspeth was 24 years old, though the sun and the work had etched a more serious and timeless expression onto her face. She was built for the land, sturdy and broad-shouldered, with hands that were calloused but careful. Her hair, the color of dried corn silk, was pulled back in a practical braid that fell between her shoulder blades. In a town that valued slender figures and pastel dresses, Elspeth was an anomaly. She was often described with a careless pity as the plump farm girl, a label that acknowledged her connection to the earth while subtly dismissing her. People saw her quiet nature and her solid frame and assumed a simplicity of mind that was not there. They did not see the way her eyes, a pale and watchful blue, took in the world with a slow, deep inventory. They did not see the patience that settled in her like bedrock. The property before her was a monument to failure. The hemlock orchard stretched over 40 acres of gently rolling land, a place that had once been the pride of the county. Now it was a graveyard. The apple trees, mostly Granny Smith and a few rows of old-fashioned wine saps, stood like skeletons against the washed-out sky. Their branches were gnarled and black, twisted into shapes of agony. What few leaves clung to the limbs were withered and spotted with the telltale signs of fire blight, a disease that had swept through years ago and never left. The ground beneath them was bare in patches, littered with the mummified remains of last year's diseased fruit. The air itself smelled wrong, a mix of decay and the lingering metallic scent of chemical sprays that had long ago proven useless. This was the crisis, the insurmountable problem. The hemlock orchard was not just sick, it was pronounced dead. The County Agricultural Extension Office had a file 3 inches thick on the property. It was a case study in futility. Old Man Hemlock, the previous owner, had fought the blight for nearly a decade. He had followed every piece of modern advice offered to him. He had sprayed fungicides until the creek at the bottom of the property ran cloudy. He had pruned aggressively, burning massive pyres of infected limbs that filled the valley with an acrid smoke for weeks at a time. He had even, in a final act of desperation, bulldozed the entire western section of the orchard, hoping to create a firebreak against the disease. The blight had simply laughed, creeping back into the new growth with a vengeance. The history of the failure was common knowledge, a cautionary tale told over coffee at the co-op. Hemlock had mortgaged his family's land to pay for the chemicals, the equipment, the expert consultations. He had lost it all. The bank had held the property for 2 years, unable to find a buyer willing to take on such a blighted and poisoned piece of ground. It had become a permanent, unsolvable issue, a scar on the landscape that reminded everyone of the fine line between a farmer's ambition and his ruin. The community had accepted its fate. The orchard was a place to be driven past, not looked at, a place to be forgotten. But Elspeth May had not forgotten. She had been watching it, studying it from a distance for a very long time. She possessed a different kind of knowledge, a knowledge that did not come from university or a chemical company. It came from a locked wooden chest in her small farmhouse, and from the memory of a man who had taught her to read the land not as a problem to be solved, but as a story to be understood. The next morning, Elspeth drove her father's old Ford F-100 into town. The truck, a 1968 model in a faded robin's egg blue, rumbled with a steady, reliable rhythm. She parked in front of the Braxton County Agricultural Extension Office, a neat brick building that smelled of floor wax and government forms. Inside, the air was cool and still. Behind a polished wooden desk sat Dale Thurmond. Dale was the foil to everything Elspeth represented. He was a young man, a few years older than her, with a fresh degree from the state university and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He wore a crisp, short-sleeved shirt and a tie, and his hands were clean, the nails perfectly trimmed. His office was a shrine to modern, institutional agriculture. A framed diploma hung on the wall, flanked by glossy charts illustrating crop yields and soil nutrient levels. He believed in data, in spreadsheets, in solutions that came in sealed plastic jugs with detailed instructions printed on the label. He saw farming as a science of inputs and outputs, a battle to be won with technology and chemistry. He greeted Elspeth with a professional but condescending smile. "Elspeth, what can I do for you? Your father's fields looking all right? How about the latest report on cutworm prevalence, if you need it?" "My father's fields are fine," she said, her voice quiet and even. "I'm here about the old hemlock place." Dale's smile tightened. He leaned back in his chair, a gesture of practiced authority. "Ah, the orchard. I heard the bank was getting desperate to unload it. I hope you're not thinking of it for yourself. It's a waste of good money, even at the price they're asking." He swiveled in his chair and pulled a thick file from a gray metal cabinet. He dropped it on the desk with a thud. "Hemlock, Robert. 40 acres. Primary crop, Malus domestica. Primary problem, Erwinia amylivora. Systemic and catastrophic." He recited the information as if reading an obituary. He opened the file and began his assessment, flipping through pages of soil analyses, lab reports, and field notes. "Look here," he said, tapping a column of figures with a perfectly manicured finger. "Soil pH is down to 45 in some spots. That's acidic enough to leach aluminum out of the clay, which is poison to apple roots. We've got residual copper levels from the fungicides that are off the charts. It's a chemical sink. Nothing will grow there properly for a decade." He showed her infrared photographs taken by a state survey plane. The orchard was a sickly purple color, a stark contrast to the healthy green of the surrounding farms. "There's no life there, Elspeth. The trees that are still standing are systemically infected. The blight isn't just on the branches. It's in the vascular tissue of the trees themselves. It's in the roots. You can't prune that out. You can't spray it away." Elspeth listened patiently, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She had a few quiet questions. "What about the water table? Did anyone test the deep water?" Dale gave a short, dismissive laugh. "The water table? We tested the surface runoff for chemical contamination, of course. It's bad, but the water table is irrelevant. The problem is the blight and the soil chemistry. The solution, if you can call it that, is to bulldoze every last tree, truck in tons of lime to try and correct the pH, and plant it with a cover crop for at least 5 years to try and remediate the soil. Even then, you'd be lucky to get a decent crop of soybeans out of it. As for putting an orchard back in, you're looking at 20 years, minimum. You'd be throwing your money into a dead hole." He closed the file with an air of finality. His professional assessment was delivered. The case was closed. Elspeth simply nodded. "Thank you for your time, Dale." She stood up and left the office, leaving him shaking his head with a mixture of pity and frustration at the stubborn ignorance of country folk. Her next stop was the Braxton County Farmers Co-op. It was the nerve center of the local farming community, a place that smelled of sweet feed, fertilizer, and old coffee. A group of older men, the unofficial chorus of skeptics, were gathered around the counter. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose farm bordered the hemlock place, was holding court. "Saw the May girl's truck over at the extension office," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, as Elspeth walked in. "Word is she's sniffing around that old dead orchard." A murmur went through the group. They turned to look at her, their expressions a familiar blend of curiosity and condescension. They had known her since she was a child. They had known her father and her grandfather before him. They respected the May family's history of hard work, but this was different. This was foolishness. "You ain't serious, are you, Elspeth?" Another farmer, a man named George, asked. "That place is cursed. Hemlock poured a fortune into that ground and got nothing but heartache back. Dale Thurman says it's poisoned right down to the bedrock," Mr. Abernathy added, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Said you'd have better luck planting apples on the moon. He's got the science to prove it." The community reaction was a mirror of Dale's institutional assessment, but cruder and more direct. They saw her as a naive young woman, perhaps touched by grief from her father's recent passing, about to squander the small inheritance he had left her. They saw her sturdy frame and quiet demeanor and mistook it for a lack of sophistication. The laughter was not malicious, but it was dismissive. It was the sound of conventional wisdom reinforcing itself, of a community closing ranks around a shared and incorrect certainty. Elspeth did not argue. She did not defend herself. She bought a bag of bolts for her father's disc harrow, paid in cash, and walked out into the hot afternoon sun. Their words followed her, echoing the same sentiment she had heard in Dale's clean, cool office. You can't fix it. It's a lost cause. You're making a mistake. Her isolation was complete. She was armed with a knowledge that no one else believed, a knowledge that had no place in their world of soil tests and university reports. That evening, in the quiet of her small, clean farmhouse, Elspeth knelt on the floor of her grandfather's old room. From under the bed, she pulled a heavy wooden chest made of dark, fragrant cedar. The lock was old brass, and she opened it with a small, worn key that she kept on a leather cord. The air filled with the scent of old paper and dried herbs. This was the source of her knowledge, the pivot to her past. Inside the chest lay a collection of a dozen notebooks. They were simple, ledger-style books, bound in black cardboard. The pages were filled with the dense, looping script of her grandfather, Silas May. Silas had been the mentor figure in her life, a man who had shaped her understanding of the world. He had died when she was 16, but his presence was still a powerful force in her life. He was a man of few words, but deep observation. He had never finished high school, yet he understood the intricate workings of the land with a profundity that baffled men with advanced degrees. He had taught her that the most important tool on a farm was not a tractor or a plow, but a pair of patient eyes. Silas had been a watcher. He watched the way the wind bent the grass, the way the water flowed after a storm, the way the insects moved through the clover. He had taught Elspeth to do the same. The land will tell you its secrets, he used to say, his voice a low rumble. But you have to learn its language, and its language is slow. His lessons were her inheritance, more valuable than any sum of money. She lifted one of the notebooks from the chest. Its cover was worn smooth at the edges. The label, written in faded black ink, read, 1953, Orchard Notes and Water. She opened it carefully. The pages were a testament to a different kind of science, one based on decades of direct, intimate experience with this specific corner of the world. There were no chemical formulas or statistical analyses. Instead, there were detailed drawings of root systems, hand-drawn maps of water flow, and meticulous records of rainfall, temperature, and bloom dates, all cross-referenced with notes on the health of the trees. Elspeth turned the fragile pages until she found the entry she was looking for. It was dated July 1954. The entry described a problem Silas had encountered in a neighbor's small pear orchard, a patch of ground that had been suffering from a similar, mysterious ailment. The university experts had called it blight. They had recommended the same sprays, the same aggressive pruning. Nothing had worked. Here, in her grandfather's elegant script, was the core principle, the simple, powerful truth that formed the foundation of her plan. The blight is not the sickness, Silas had written. The blight is the symptom. It is the fever that tells you the body is unwell. The sickness is in the water. The trees are drinking poison from their own roots. He went on to describe something he called sour water. He theorized that in certain parts of the county, years of shallow plowing and compaction from heavy equipment had created an impermeable layer of clay a few feet below the surface. He called a hardpan. This layer prevented deep drainage. Water would hit the hardpan and sit there, becoming stagnant and anaerobic, cutting the deeper roots off from oxygen and allowing harmful minerals to concentrate. The tree's upper roots were drawing life from the topsoil, but their deep taproots, the ones that gave them resilience and strength, were slowly drowning in this sour water. This chronic stress weakened the trees, making them vulnerable to diseases like fire blight, which a healthy tree could easily fight off. The physical manifestation of this knowledge was right there in her hands. The notebooks were the record of a lifetime of observation. Silas had documented his solution. He hadn't used chemicals. He hadn't bulldozed the trees. He had taken his old Alice Chalmers crawler, fitted it with a single, long-toothed subsoiler, and cut deep, narrow channels between the rows of pear trees. He had broken through the hardpan. Then he had filled the channels with lime and manure to change the soil's structure and chemistry from below. He had healed the water, and in healing the water, he had healed the trees. A year later, the pear orchard was healthy and productive again. Elspeth closed the notebook. The path forward was clear. Dale Thurmond and the men at the co-op were looking at the leaves. Her grandfather had taught her to look at the roots. They saw a chemical problem to be attacked. She saw a systems problem to be healed. She held in her hands not just a theory, but a tested and proven method, a piece of wisdom that had been forgotten by a world in a hurry for quick, easy answers. The next day, she went to the bank and bought the hemlock orchard for a price that was little more than the cost of the land taxes. The deed was signed. Elspeth's folly had officially begun. The first act of reclamation did not involve the trees. It involved the tools. Elspeth did not go into debt for a new, powerful tractor. Instead, she went to the back of the barn, to a corner where a collection of old, forgotten equipment sat under a thick layer of dust and swallows' nests. There, covered by a faded canvas tarp, was her grandfather's tractor. It was a 1958 John Deere 420 crawler, a small, tough machine designed for work in orchards and vineyards. It was low and narrow, able to move between the rows of trees without damaging the branches. It had been sitting for almost a decade. She spent the first week bringing it back to life. This was her methodical application of knowledge, beginning not with the land, but with the machine that would work it. She drained the old, sludgy oil and replaced it. She pulled the spark plugs, cleaned them of their carbon fouling, and set the gap with a feeler gauge. She removed the carburetor, disassembled it on a clean cloth on the barn floor, and meticulously cleaned the jets with a fine wire. She cleaned the glass sediment bowl, removing the rust and varnish that had collected there over the years. She filled the radiator with fresh water and the fuel tank with gasoline. The community, what little of it passed by on the dirt road, saw her covered in grease, wrestling with the old machine. They saw it as another sign of her foolishness. Mr. Abernathy, driving his massive air-conditioned John Deere 4440, slowed down and shook his head. He saw a young woman playing with a museum piece, a relic from a bygone era. He did not see the deep, practical knowledge in her hands as she torqued the head bolts or timed the magneto. He did not understand that she had chosen this specific tool for a specific purpose. Its small size and lightweight were essential. A heavy modern tractor would only further compact the already damaged soil. The 420 crawler would tread lightly, its tracks distributing its weight, healing the ground rather than harming it further. On the seventh day, she was ready. She climbed into the warm metal seat, set the choke, and pulled the starter lever. The engine turned over once, twice, then coughed to life with a puff of blue smoke and a satisfyingly rough idle. The sound echoed in the quiet barn, a sound of resurrection. Her other tools were just as unconventional by modern standards. She did not buy a new chainsaw. She took down her grandfather's old steel 08S, a heavy, direct-drive saw from the 1960s. She filed the chain by hand, each tooth sharpened to a precise angle. She cleaned the air filter and filled it with fresh, properly mixed fuel. Her pruning tools were a collection of well-cared-for implements, a pair of Swiss-made Felco pruners, their blades honed to a razor's edge, a long-handled lopper, and a Swedish steel bow saw for the larger limbs. These were not power tools designed for speed, but hand tools designed for precision. They required patience and a strong arm, but they made clean, careful cuts that would allow the trees to heal properly. Her quiet, deliberate actions were a direct contradiction to the world of modern agriculture. While her neighbors were buying bigger, faster, and more expensive equipment, Elspeth was investing her time in the slow, methodical restoration of the old. She was not just fixing machines, She was reestablishing a connection to a different way of working, a way that valued understanding over horsepower and patience over profit. Her work had begun, not with a roar, but with a quiet, steady rhythm of maintenance and preparation. With the crawler running, Elspeth began the real work. She was armed with her hidden knowledge, and she acted on it without seeking anyone's approval or validation. Her first target was not the trees, but the ground itself. She hitched the crawler to a single-shank subsoiler, a simple but powerful implement that was little more than a long, curved piece of steel designed to slice deep into the earth. She started at the highest point of the orchard and drove the crawler slowly, carefully, down the exact center of a row. She lowered the subsoiler, and the steel tooth bit into the hard, dry ground. The small John Deere engine strained, its tone deepening as it took the load. The tracks dug in, churning the dusty soil. Behind the tractor, a thin, deep line was carved into the earth, a surgical incision into the compacted land. For the first 18 inches, the soil that came up was dry, pale clay. Then, with a lurch and a groan from the tractor, the point of the subsoiler broke through something. The engine revved slightly as the resistance lessened. Elspeth stopped the tractor and got off. She knelt down and looked at the soil that had been heaved up from the bottom of the cut. It was different. It was a dark, greasy-looking clay, slick and smelling of stagnant water and sulfur. It was the hardpan. Her grandfather had been right. It was exactly as he had described it in his notebook. She spent the next 2 weeks engaged in this slow, arduous process. She cut a single, deep channel down the middle of every row of trees. The work was monotonous and physically demanding. The sun beat down on her, and the dust from the crawler coated her skin and clothes. She worked from dawn until dusk, stopping only to eat a simple lunch of bread and cheese in the shade of the one great oak tree that stood at the edge of the property. The process was deliberate and detailed. She was not simply plowing. She was performing a kind of subterranean surgery on the land. Each pass with the subsoiler was a careful act, designed to shatter the impermeable layer without excessively disturbing the topsoil or the delicate feeder roots of the trees near the surface. She drove the crawler at a steady, creeping pace, listening to the engine, feeling the resistance of the ground through the levers in her hands. She was in a dialogue with the land, responding to its texture and its history. Dale Thurman drove by several times during this period. He saw her on the tiny, ancient tractor, carving what looked like useless ditches in a dead orchard. From his perspective, her actions were nonsensical. He saw it as a desperate, ignorant act, like someone tried to plow a parking lot. He mentioned it to the men at the co-op. "Saw the May girl out there again," he said, shaking his head. "She's tilling a graveyard. I don't know what she thinks she's accomplishing, but it's a sad sight to see." The chorus of skeptics nodded in agreement. Her strange methods only confirmed their initial assessment. She was in over her head, a foolish girl wasting her time and money on a lost cause. After the subsoiling was complete, the orchard was striped with deep, narrow furrows. The next stage of the process began. Elspeth bought supplies not from the co-op, where she would have to endure the pitying stares and unsolicited advice, but from a supplier in the next county. A large truck arrived one morning and deposited a massive pile of agricultural lime and another of gypsum. Using a small trailer hitched to the crawler, she began the slow work of amending the soil. She loaded the trailer by hand with a shovel, then drove the crawler down each row, shoveling the white powder directly into the deep channel she had cut. The lime was to correct the soil's acidity, raising the pH to a level where the apple trees could once again access the nutrients in the soil. The gypsum was to improve the soil structure, breaking down the dense clay and allowing water and air to penetrate. It was back-breaking labor. Each shovelful was a small act of faith. She was not applying a quick-fix chemical fertilizer that would provide a temporary jolt of nitrogen. She was making a fundamental, long-term change to the very structure and chemistry of the earth. She was treating the cause of the sickness, not just the symptoms. Her work was a slow, patient conversation with the soil, a process of healing that could not be rushed. Only after she had addressed the water and the soil did Elspeth turn her attention to the trees themselves. This was the part of her work that was most visible and most criticized. The conventional wisdom for dealing with fire blight was to prune out any infected wood, cutting several inches back into healthy tissue. Old Man Hemlock had done this for years, and it had only seemed to spread the disease. The men at the co-op expected her to do the same, or to simply give up and cut the trees down for firewood. Elspeth's approach, guided by her grandfather's notebooks, was different. She performed a radical, restorative pruning that shocked anyone who saw it. She started with the old steel chainsaw, cutting out the large, completely dead limbs first. She worked with a surgeon's precision, making careful cuts just outside the branch collar, the raised area of bark where the limb joined the trunk. This would allow the tree to heal the wound properly, sealing it off from disease. Then she switched to her loppers and hand pruners. She moved through the orchard, tree by tree, with a slow, methodical rhythm. She did not just remove the blighted branches. She thinned the entire canopy of each tree, removing crossing branches, weak shoots, and suckers. Her goal was not just to remove the disease, but to open up the tree to allow sunlight and air to penetrate to the very center. The blight thrived in damp, shady conditions. By creating a more open structure, she was changing the environment, making the trees less hospitable to the disease. Mr. Abernathy watched her from his property line one afternoon, his arms crossed over his chest. He saw her cutting away what he considered to be healthy wood along with the diseased. To his eyes, she was butchering the trees, finishing the job the blight had started. "She's lost her mind," he told his wife that evening. "She's cutting them trees to ribbons. There won't be anything left of them by the time she's done." But Elspeth was not butchering them. She was saving them. Each cut was a calculated decision, based on the principles in the notebooks and her own deep, intuitive understanding of the trees. She was thinking about the flow of energy, of sap, through the tree. She was removing the weak growth to redirect the tree's limited resources into the strong, healthy framework that remained. She was giving them a chance to breathe, to gather sunlight, to marshal their own defenses. She was not imposing her will on them. She was collaborating with them, helping them to heal themselves. The final step in her methodical application was the ground itself. After she had finished the pruning, the orchard floor was littered with branches, which she gathered and burned. The ground was now more open to the sun. She hitched an old disc harrow to the crawler and made a light pass over the entire 40 acres, breaking up the surface of the soil. Then she seeded it. She did not plant a cash crop. She planted a carefully selected cover crop mix, the recipe for which came directly from her grandfather's notes. It was a blend of several species, white clover and hairy vetch to fix nitrogen in the soil, enriching it naturally, tillage radishes with their thick, deep taproots that would further break up the compacted soil as they grew and then decomposed, and a mix of wildflowers to attract bees and other beneficial insects. She used an old, hand-cranked seed spreader, walking the entire 40 acres on foot. It took her 4 long days. As she walked, broadcasting the tiny seeds onto the prepared ground, she was completing the system. The deep channels would manage the water. The lime and gypsum would heal the soil's chemistry. The pruning would restore the health and vigor of the trees. And the cover crop would create a living, breathing ecosystem on the orchard floor, a community of plants working together to support the trees. The skeptics observed all of this and saw only madness. They saw a woman performing strange, outdated rituals on a dead piece of land. They saw wasted effort, wasted time, and wasted money. They saw Elspeth's folly reaching its sad, illogical conclusion. They did not see the deep, interconnected logic of her actions. They did not understand that she was not just a farmer. She was an ecologist, a restorer of a broken system. She had finished her work. Now, all she could do was wait. A month passed. The relentless heat of June gave way to the deep, humid warmth of July. Then, one afternoon, the sky turned a bruised purple-gray. A gentle, soaking rain began to fall. It was not a violent thunderstorm that would cause the topsoil to wash away, but a slow, steady rain that lasted for 2 days. This was the first test of Elspeth's system. On the neighboring farms, the water pooled in the low spots, running off the compacted fields in muddy sheets. In the May orchard, something different happened. The water soaked into the cover crop ground. The excess flowed gently towards the deep channels Elspeth had cut. Instead of pooling and stagnating, it was drawn down, deep into the earth, percolating through the newly fractured hardpan. The land was drinking again for the first time in years. A week after the rain, the first signs of success began to appear. They were small, almost imperceptible at first. Elspeth walked the rows, her eyes scanning the dark, gnarled branches of the apple trees. And then she saw it. On a branch of a Granny Smith tree that had looked completely dead, a tiny, bright green bud was pushing its way out of the old wood. Then another and another. They were not everywhere, not on every tree, but they were there. It was a sign of life, a quiet, stubborn refusal to die. At the same time, the orchard floor began to transform. The cover crop seeds, awakened by the rain, sprouted. A faint green haze appeared on the dusty ground, which thickened day by day into a lush, vibrant carpet of clover and vetch. The smell of the orchard began to change. The old scent of dust and decay was replaced by the fresh, sweet smell of new growth, of damp earth, of life. The air itself felt different, softer, and more humid. The change was undeniable. Dale Thurmond was forced to drive past the orchard on his way to inspect Mr. Abernathy's cornfields, which were showing signs of nitrogen deficiency. As he crested the hill, he slowed his truck, then stopped it in the middle of the road. He had been so certain, so confident in his data and his reports. But the sight before him was a direct contradiction to everything he believed. He got out of his truck and stood by the fence row, staring. The orchard was no longer skeleton. The trees were cloaked in a delicate green mist of new leaves. The ground beneath them was not bare and cracked, but a rich, living tapestry of green. He could not understand it. It did not fit his models. It defied his science. He saw life where his reports had promised only a slow, lingering death. He felt a flicker of something he had not felt in a long time: doubt. He got back in his truck without approaching Elspeth, his mind racing, trying to reconcile the sterile facts in his file with the vibrant reality before his eyes. His reevaluation had begun, not with an admission of error, but with a profound and unsettling silence. The weeks that followed were a quiet explosion of life. The new leaves on the apple trees grew larger and darker, no longer the pale, sickly green of a struggling plant, but the deep, vigorous green of a healthy one. Then came the blossoms. It was late in the season for a full bloom, but the trees, revived by the changes in the soil and water, put forth a surprising number of flowers. The orchard, which had been silent for so long, was suddenly filled with the low, industrious hum of thousands of bees, drawn for miles around to the feast of clover, wildflowers, and apple blossoms. The climax of Elspeth's work arrived in late September. It was the final result, the undeniable proof. The trees were not just alive, they were heavy with fruit. It was not a perfect crop. The apples were smaller than the commercial ideal, and some bore the cosmetic scars of the previous year's struggles. But they were abundant. The branches, which had been bare and brittle just a few months before, now bowed under the weight of a harvest that had no right to exist. Elspeth began to pick. She hired a local teenager, a quiet boy named Leo who needed a summer job. At first, he was just there for the wage, but as the days went on, he began to watch Elspeth, to see the quiet competence in her work, the deep satisfaction she took in the harvest. The success was absolute. The quantification of that success was not measured in spreadsheets or profit margins, but in bushel baskets. They filled hundreds of them. The yield per acre was not just respectable, it was miraculous. Elspeth's folly had produced a harvest. She did not have the equipment or the desire to compete with the large commercial orchards. She did not grade the apples for size or polish them for sale in a grocery store. She loaded the old Ford truck with wooden crates filled with the fresh, crisp fruit and drove it to the farmer's market in town. She put up a simple, hand-painted sign: May orchard apples. $3 a basket. People were hesitant at first. They remembered the stories. They knew this fruit came from the dead orchard. But the apples themselves were their own best advertisement. They were crisp and juicy, with a complex, tangy flavor that was missing from the bland, perfect-looking apples trucked in from elsewhere. The first few customers came back the next week for more. Word began to spread. Soon, there was a line at her stall every Saturday morning. She sold out within hours. But she did not raise her prices. She had not done this for profit. She had done it to prove that the orchard could be healed. She began to give the apples away. She dropped off crates at the local church for their food pantry. She gave them to the school cafeteria. She left baskets on the porches of her elderly neighbors. One season later, the dead orchard was helping to feed the county. The contrast with Dale Thurman's earlier, flawed projections was stark. He had predicted a decade of barren soil. He had projected zero yield. He had advised a solution that would have cost tens of thousands of dollars and resulted in a field of soybeans. The math he had relied on had been proven spectacularly wrong. The quiet, patient math of Elspeth May, the calculation of soil pH, water drainage, and symbiotic planting, had been proven right. The final result was not just a harvest of apples, but a harvest of vindication. One cool evening in early October, as Elspeth was washing the day's dust from her face at the kitchen sink, she saw the headlights of a truck turn into her long gravel driveway. It was Dale Thurman's clean, county-issued pickup. He parked near the barn and got out. He was not carrying his usual clipboard. He held his hat in his hands, turning it over and over in a nervous gesture. The foil was returning, not to argue, not to advise, but to understand. Elspeth dried her hands on a towel and went out to meet him on the porch. He stood there for a moment in the twilight, looking from her to the darkened rows of the now thriving orchard. He looked humbled, his usual air of crisp, professional certainty completely gone. Elspeth, he began, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual condescension. I came to say I was wrong. The acknowledgement, the admission of error, hung in the still air between them. It was a simple statement, but for a man like Dale, a man whose entire identity was built on being right, it was a profound concession. I don't understand how you did this, he continued, finally looking her in the eye. Everything I learned, everything the university taught me, said this was impossible. The soil tests, the blight analysis, it was an open and shut case. A total loss. Elspeth did not gloat. There was no triumph in her expression, only a quiet calm. She had not been engaged in a battle with him, but with the land's sickness. His opinion had been an irrelevant distraction. Would you like a glass of water? She asked. He nodded, and she led him into the simple, clean kitchen. She handed him a glass of cool well water, and he drank it gratefully. Then, the protagonist explained. She did not lecture him. She did not recite facts and figures. She simply went to the cedar chest in her grandfather's room and returned with one of the black notebooks. She laid it on the kitchen table and opened it to the page she had read so many months before, the entry on sour water. She pointed to her grandfather's looping script. My grandfather taught me that the problem wasn't the tree, she said softly. It was the root's drink. He used to say, you can't heal a man by painting his face if his water is poisoned. You are looking at the fever on the leaves. He taught me to look for the source of the sickness deep in the ground. She explained the principle of the hard pan, of the stagnant water, of the way it weakened the trees and made them vulnerable. She showed him her grandfather's drawings of the subsoil, his notes on the restorative power of lime and gypsum, his recipe for the cover crop that would build a healthy soil ecosystem. She was not sharing a secret formula. She was sharing a philosophy, a different way of seeing the land. Dale listened, his face a mixture of astonishment and dawning comprehension. He gently touched the old, fragile page of the notebook, as if it were a sacred text. He was a man of science, of data. But here was a different kind of data, collected not over a semester in a lab, but over a lifetime of patient observation. It was a science that was holistic, intuitive, and deeply connected to a specific place. He stayed for over an hour, asking quiet, respectful questions. He was trying to fit this new, old wisdom into his modern framework, and finding that it was bigger than he had imagined. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated. "Would it be possible," he asked, his voice full of a newfound humility, "for me to borrow this? Just for a night? I need to understand this." Elspeth nodded and let him take the notebook. A systemic change was beginning, not just in the soil of the orchard, but in the mind of the man who was supposed to be the county's expert. Dale went home and spent the night reading Silas May's words, a humbling education that invalidated much of what he thought he knew. A week later, Dale returned the notebook. He was a changed man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. He told Elspeth that he had written a new report for the state agricultural extension. He had officially reversed his assessment of the Hemlock property, classifying it as a successful, if unconventional, reclamation. He did not take credit for it. He cited the work of a local landowner employing generational farming techniques. More importantly, he had used what he had learned to propose a new pilot program for the county. It was designed to help other farmers with failed or marginal plots of land, not with chemicals and expensive inputs, but with the principles of deep soil remediation and ecosystem health that he had learned from Elspeth and her grandfather. He had taken the knowledge he had once dismissed and was now working to adopt it into the larger system. He was no longer just a man of new systems. He was a man who had learned the value of the old ones. The reconciliation was complete, not just between two people, but between two entire worldviews. In the years that followed, the story of the orchard settled into the landscape of Braxton County. The narrative returns now to a key object, the enduring symbol of Elspeth's success. Under the broad, healthy branches of a massive Granny Smith apple tree, the 1958 John Deere 420 crawler was parked. It was not left to rust. It was maintained, its metal clean and lightly oiled, its fuel tank full, ready to work. It was no longer a museum piece or a relic. It had become a symbol of a timeless and durable kind of knowledge. The massive air-conditioned tractors of the neighboring farms were traded in every few years for newer, more powerful models, monuments to debt and depreciation. The little crawler, however, endured. It represented the idea of the right tool for the right job, a tool whose value was not in its horsepower or its newness, but in its perfect suitability for a delicate and specific task. It was a testament to the fact that some things do not become obsolete. The new stasis, the new normal, settled over the 40 acres. The name Elspeth's Folly faded from the local vocabulary, replaced by the simple, respectful title of the May Orchard. It became a landmark. People from surrounding counties would drive to Braxton in the fall to buy her apples, not just for their flavor, but for the story that came with them. The orchard was no longer a remarkable miracle. Its success had become an accepted, respected part of the local geography and lore. The laughter at the co-op had long since been replaced by a quiet and profound respect. The men who had pitted her now sought her advice, asking her quiet questions about their own troubled patches of ground. The orchard's health was no longer an anomaly. It was simply true. The legacy of the knowledge found its future in the boy who had helped with the first harvest. Leo had continued to work for Elspeth every summer. He was no longer just a hired hand working for a wage. He had become a quiet and observant apprentice. He had seen the proof of her methods, and he was hungry to understand the principles behind them. He was the successor, the one to whom the torch would be passed. One warm afternoon, Elspeth found him not working, but standing in the middle of a row, looking intently at the place where the trunk of a tree met the earth. She walked over to him quietly. "What do you see?" she asked. "I'm looking at the graft union," he said, pointing. "I'm trying to see how the rootstock is influencing the growth of the scion. It's different on the wine saps than it is on the Granny Smiths." He was beginning to see the land not as a surface, but as a complex system of interactions. He was learning the language. Elspeth smiled. She went back to the farmhouse and returned with one of her grandfather's notebooks, one he had not yet seen. It was titled Rootstock and Scion, The Unseen Partnership. She handed it to him. "My grandfather believed the foundation of the tree was just as important as the part that bore the fruit," she said. "He wrote all his thoughts down in here." Section. Section. Leo took the book with a reverence that reminded Elspeth of Dale Thurmond. He opened it and began to read. In that quiet moment, the knowledge was explicitly passed down. It was not a formal lesson in a classroom, but a gift, an inheritance of wisdom transferred from one generation to the next. The future of the orchard, and the philosophy that had saved it, was secure. The story of the May orchard became a quiet parable in Braxton County. It was a story about more than just apples. It was about the difference between looking and seeing. It was about the value of a knowledge that is earned slowly, over generations, a knowledge that is held in the hands and in the heart, not just in the mind. It was a reminder that the earth is not a machine to be controlled, but a living system to be understood. The final thematic statement was written not in words, but in the rustling leaves of 40 acres of healthy trees. Some things don't get solved by shouting new answers at them. They get healed by listening to the old questions the land has been asking all along.